Okay, in terms of the stuff, first, sadly, tragically, spring break has ended. Sad. Deadlines remain the same. Namely, exam 2, covering part 2, quiz and assignments part 3. Deadline April 5th, so not this exciting Friday, but the next exciting Friday, and then the day. And then April 26th, the last day of classes. We'll have our last class before that, because we're on Tuesday, Thursday. Exam 3, exam 4, quiz and assignments part 4, deadline April 26th, and then the day. And again, the reason why everything sort of piles up there is because there's no more like extra month after that, because that's the end. Exam 5, the final covering all the things. Deadlines Wednesday at 5 p.m. for finals. Again, everything's available since day 0, but just be sure to complete it before the deadlines. And to see if you need the final or not, I'll make note of this more so in the future. Once you've done all the exams you wish to do, the first 4, all the quiz and assignments you wish to do, you look at your overall grade. If it's an A, you're done. If you can't get more A, you can A. If it's less than an A, you can get the grade estimator, put in your best 3 exams, put in the quiz, overall grade, assignment overall grade, put in hypothetical 100 for your final, and see what that does. If that's a letter grade or better than your real overall grade, then the final could help you. However, if it can't give you enough points to get another letter grade above what you already got, then it would change nothing. And it's already set to be a 0 if you haven't done it, so if you don't do it, nothing changed, because it's already treated as if you haven't done it. Okay, so that's the upcoming stuff. Before moving to our new stuff, any stuff about stuff?
So do our pre-exam, like the exams that we take before the exam, that doesn't count towards your grades, does it?
The practice ones?
Mm-hmm.
No, the sample exams are just samples. They don't count on the downside, they don't count for you,
Okay.
but they don't count against you. They're still worth looking at though, because they give you a chance to see how you do, and also they're drawn from the same question bank, so you might see some repeats. Okay, so last time we were doing our adventures in chapter 10, looking at inductive logic. And as we saw back in those ancient days before spring break, inductive logic deals in probability. So no matter how well you build an inductive argument, all the premises could be true, you could do all your reasoning as well as you could, and the conclusion could still turn out to be false. And that's known as the problem of induction. And it's just something we have to live with because induction. Now there are cases though, even though every inductive argument could fail, there are ones that are bad enough that they're considered fallacies. So in the case of a deductive fallacy, we saw that they're invalid, they're deductive fallacies. Inductive arguments though don't have that bipolarity. It's not valid, invalid, it's strong, less strong, less strong, less strong, weakish, weaker, weakest. So you have this spectrum. And because of that, you don't get into fallacies until you start heading into the weak territory. To use an analogy, you could think of like, medicine. There's usually a range in the dosage. So if you're like at the high dose, it's the effective, that kind of goes off and then doesn't work at all. Inductive fallacies are kind of the same way. You hit a certain point where it goes from being okay to bad reasoning. And the first one we saw was the classic fallacy of hasty generalization. And the idea there, is sort of laid out in the name, is that you've got a target population and you've got a sample that is too small. To be more technical, the confidence put in the sample is not in proportion to its size. So the confidence exceeds its size. Now, depending on what approach you're taking and how you express your conclusion, you could have a small sample and have it be not this fallacy, depending on excuse me, pixels again, depending on what you're doing. So if you have a small sample and you express like really low confidence, like I have a small sample, so it indicates something about this population, but you got to be really careful about it. That wouldn't be the mistake. The mistake is basically being overconfident in a sample that's too small. Stereotypes are often built upon this. A person has like a bad or good experience and then generalizes to everybody in that class or all businesses in that franchise or all like a whole state from one experience. And those would typically be, hasty generalizations that lead to stereotypes. The defense against it is to ask, is my sample actually big enough to justify my conclusion? If the answer is no, it doesn't mean you're wrong. Like the example I gave before about Ohio having terrifying drivers, turned out I was right, but initially my sample was too small. But as I spent more and more time in Ohio, the sample grew, and it went from being hasty to okay. Our next one is the closely related fallacy of anecdotal evidence. And we'll see this twice. We'll see it here, and we'll see it again in the future as a causal fallacy. Here's the idea. An anecdote is a story, a tale, often, trying to establish or prove a point. Now, anecdotes can be entertaining, amusing. They can also be psychologically very effective, which is one reason people use them. But, of course, logically, they have very little force. Why? Well, here's the fallacy. Here's why it's a fallacy. First definition. It occurs when a person draws a general conclusion from an anecdote about one or a very small number of cases. So, at this point, it's very similar to a hasty generalization because the problem is too small. What makes it anecdotal evidence, not just hasty, is that anecdote part, that there's this story being told. Now, getting to the more formal part of it is, it's not the problem that's just like, it's an anecdote and small. Again, the problem is that the person puts too much confidence in a conclusion that's only supported by an anecdote involving one or a few examples. So how can we more sharply distinguish it from hasty generalization? Well, here's sort of the definitive hallmark that makes it stand out. And here's how it goes. What a person does when they're doing this, like in the paradigm case, is they present the anecdote involving one or two examples, and they generalize from that. And sort of the defining characteristic is this. They actually make reference to statistical data that supports a general claim that goes against their claim. So sort of in the paradigm case, they point to an anecdote, sample or two that doesn't fit, explicitly rejecting many other cases in favor of their own conclusion. And that would be the paradigm case. Now, it may not always be done. So a person may just refer to anecdotes, draw the general claim, in which case you may say, is it anecdote, is it hasty generalization? But the paradigm case is again, person makes this claim, they explicitly reject statistical data that supports a general claim in favor of their one or two examples that go against it. Why is that bad logic? Well, the reason is that similar reason to why the hasty generalization is bad logic. If we have an example or two that doesn't adequately represent the whole population. And of course, we would expect that a whole population is not going to be identical. So you would expect, just by chance or other factors, there'll always be examples that don't fit the generality. Because unless it's 100%, there's always going to be exceptions. You're always going to find things that don't fit. But if we go from the small number to the whole, we're making that leap. So there would be some concrete examples of how people use this bad logic. Well, one common example I see quite a bit, I used to see more of. Back when I was younger, I was running fanatic, and like all fanatics, I would try to convert people to the one true view, which is of course running. And whenever I'd say to people, hey, you got this thing on, turn you on to, it's this thing called running. And people would typically say to me like, well, typically like, oh, I got, my knees don't work, or they're in the shop or something. But a very common thing people would do is they would say, oh, remember that guy, Jim Fix, who dropped dead running? Or there'd be someone who dies of a heart attack during a marathon, or for any athlete, or they bring in other athletes. They say, oh, that high school basketball player who dropped dead on the court, and they bring in examples of people who died while engaging in fitness. And they'd say exercise is super dangerous, just like Jim Fix died, that guy playing basketball, that football player. you're better off just staying perfectly still, otherwise you'll die. Now, that of course is anecdotal evidence, because if they say, and what they'll typically do is they'll also explicitly say, yeah, I know there's all this science stuff saying that if you engage in exercise, you live longer, you're less likely to have heart attacks, but look at that case, that person who dropped dead. And so what they're doing is they're explicitly rejecting all this statistical data, that if you exercise, you live longer, your blood pressure is lower, all the good things, happen, in favor of the examples or two that don't fit. And of course that's bad logic, because they're saying, well, here's an example of someone who was exercising and died, and rejecting all the cases where people, did exercise and lived long. And also one thing that kind of clearly goes against and shows why this is a problem is the reason why those cases of someone dropping dead during a marathon makes the news is because it's really, really uncommon. You don't see headlines saying overweight smoker, alcoholic, who never exercised, who was, ate terribly, dies of heart attack, because that would be, you just have to print 1,000 newspapers every day just to cover that, because that's super common. And so that being an example of that, where someone says, oh yeah, I know there's all this data about exercise being good for you, but that person who died during a marathon shows it's all untrue. But of course, it is true that people do die while exercising, but we have to look at the statistics. People are far more likely to die from not exercising in the health complications than from exercising. Another example, people commonly use it to defend things like smoking. So if someone smoked, you said to them, smoking is really bad for you. Pretty much everyone who smokes used to have a story saying, yeah, I heard all this stuff from the Surgeon General that smoking causes cancer, blah, blah, blah. But my Aunt Jane, she smoked, 40 cigars a day, lived to be 102. So that's all just BS. Now, of course, it'd be interesting if Aunt Jane lived to be 102 smoking 40 cigars a day. That would be interesting results. But it doesn't prove that smoking isn't bad for you, because she's an exception. And in any population where something is not 100%, you'd always expect exceptions. But you wouldn't go by the exceptions to do the generalization. Now, as with hasty generalization, this often is used to support stereotypes. For example, if someone is has a racist or sexist view, they'll point to an anecdote of something, an incident that occurred, and then expand it to everything. For example, take the battle over migration. What a person might do is say, well, they'll point to an example where a migrant committed a terrible crime, and then say, look at this example of this person who committed this murder, therefore all or most of the migrants are murderers. And it'll be anecdotal evidence. And of course that story can be scary, but of course it's not statistically significant. If there's just a few examples, it doesn't prove the whole. So then why do people use anecdotes if it's, if that's all you got, why use it? Well, the reason is, of course, because it works. And here's why. People are generally bored by statistics, and they're not very persuasive. Which is why when you look at commercials, they don't have statisticians doing stats, to try to sell you products. So if you talk about all the stats, people get bored. But if you have a story, say a scary one, people put way more weight on that. So for example, if you have the stats about crimes committed by migrants, the stats show that their level of criminality is less than people who are Native Americans. So that's not particularly scary. But if you have a scary story about MS-13, that is much more effective. Now it can also be used positively. If you have positive stats about something, people also find that boring too. But if you have an inspirational story, people find that more appealing. So on the side of evil, the reason to use this is because if you have no statistical evidence, a scary story or a good story will weigh much more heavily in people's minds. Which is why politicians always use this. When Donald Trump gets up there and talks about scary stuff, he doesn't lay out stats, he presents a scary story. And the stories may be true, it may be something that actually occurred. Or if someone's trying to pitch something as positive, they'll present a positive story, but no stats. And then it's a great effect. So that single example, presented, especially if it's particularly vivid, will have a strong influence on people. So on the side of evil, it can be very useful to have anecdotes to sway people. And if your opponent brings up stats, they're going to probably lose. Now on the side of good, if you have the stats and you want to convince people you're right, you want to use your stats because that's good logic, but you also want to have a few anecdotes in there to illustrate your position. For example, Bill Clinton is pretty good at this. He'll have all the numbers and stuff, but he's a smart guy. He knows that numbers don't really convince people, so he'll have a example or anecdote or two, and they'll bring a person up to put a face on it as a persuasive device. And so it can be quite effective. Now from a logical standpoint, how do you neutralize this? Well, the thing to do is engage the part of the brain that deals with the math. And to say, okay, that's an interesting or terrifying or uplifting story, but does it represent the statistical likely thing to occur? So if we have a terrifying story about a migrant who committed murders, well, and we want to base our entire immigration policy on that story, a good question is, but is that the usual thing? Is this a statistically significant problem? This is not to say that murder is fine, murder is awful, but the question would be, do the statistics justify this policy? Or if someone has a uplifting story that's all great, it makes you feel good, and they want you to spend millions of dollars in this program, a good question still would be to ask is, okay, that's a great, wonderful story, but do we actually get a good return on our investment in this program? If it turns out for millions of dollars you have one good story, probably not a great program. So you always want to ask, okay, that's a terrifying or good story, but what are the actual numbers? But again, if you're trying to persuade people, stats are terrible, you always want to have good anecdotes. So if you want to be a good, effective persuader, and you get the truth, have your stats, have your anecdotes. On the side of evil, just use anecdotes. Works pretty well. Before pressing on, anything about anecdotal evidence that needs more ands or don'ts? Thirdly, the biased generalization / biased analogy. Now, as we saw back in the ancient days, essentially there's two ways generalizations can go evil. One is sample too small, the other is the sample is biased in some way. And you can have a sample that's pretty big, but still have it be bad logic. You get a really big sample. So what's a fallacy and how can this happen? Well, as the name nicely states, it's a generalization or analogy where the sample is biased. What does the bias mean? Well, to get a bit technical, it occurs when the sample, for whatever particular reason, is non-representative. So the way the sample is taken means it's not going to be like this population. Now, like with the other fallacies, kind of the general formal thing is sample's biased, that's a problem. But to be more technical, the problem is that the person overestimates the strength of a sample that is biased. So, strictly speaking, if you were to say, yes, my sample is biased, but it still has some, this result, you could still have a good argument because you're acknowledging the bias, you're not overestimating it. But the typical thing is just sample is biased, and the person draws a conclusion from that biased sample. So, what would be an example? How do people use this? How to defend against it? Well, here would be an example. One way that a sample can be biased and still quite large is by taking it from a group where they're probably going to give you the results you're looking for. So, for example, when it comes around to like election time or when there's an issue going on, each party or each group can always say, we have majority support for our view. And one possibility is they're all lying. The other possibility is they're being honest, but they're doing their surveys in a way to get the results they want. So there are kind of two reasons to do surveys. One is to find out the truth. The other is to get numbers that back up what you want to say, to make the claim that most people think this, to use it as a persuasive device. So one way to do this is to use the bias generalization, and it could be quite large. For example, suppose you took a poll, a survey of, say, 1,500 Fox News watchers, and you asked them, is President Trump doing a good job? What will most of the viewers probably say? Fox News?
What Fox News say about him?
Oh, no, viewers of Fox News, regular viewers.
I don't think he's.
Yeah, not all, but yeah, probably most of them would say, good job. But suppose you did a survey of MSNBC viewers during the Rachel Maddow show. They'd probably say exact opposite. It'll be like some, 2% or something. Now, both samples are large, 1,500 people, and so they don't fall victim to hasty generalization, because they're pretty big. But of course, you can get the results that you want. If you go to Fox News, you'll probably get yay Trump. If you go to MSNBC, boo Trump. Even though both samples are large, they'll have radically different views. So a person could honestly say, the majority of people surveyed favor Trump, and then the majority of people surveyed hate Trump. Which is why when they have those surveys come out saying, people are against or for something, it's important, if it matters, it's important to see, well, who are they asking? So yeah, most Fox News viewers will probably be pro-Trump. Most MSNBC viewers will be anti-Trump. And so the sample is biased because of where it's coming from. Which is why you want to try to get neutral samples. Now, bias is relative. If you want to know what most Fox viewers thought about Trump, or what most MSNBC viewers thought about Trump, they would be fine, because you'd say, here's what MSNBC viewers think about Trump, here's what Fox News viewers think about Trump. Now, if you want to know what Americans in general think about Trump, you need a more neutral survey that gets, polls from the general population, not just people who watch Fox and people who watch MSNBC. And if you pulled them together, you'd probably still get not a good result, because these would tend to be people more to the right, more to the left. Now, it can also occur on a smaller scale. So, for example, if someone's wondering, they take a class in religion, learn about atheism, and they wonder, I wonder how many people are atheists. And they go to church on Sunday and say, hey, how many people here are atheists? And no one raises their hand. They say, wow, 100% of all Americans are believers. Well, that would be a biased sample, because even if it's a really big church, they're pulling out people who are going to church. And most people, but not all, who go to church believe. There are some atheists who go to church, for various reasons. One of my friends in undergrad went because he was always hungover on Sundays, and churches were cool and quiet. He could lean his head against the pew, and he said they had the best honey biscuits in the universe. So he didn't believe any of the preaching, but he loved the honey biscuits. So how do you defend against a biased generalization? And how do you create one? Well, the way you create one is this. You find a group that's already biased the way you want them to go, and then you survey them. So, for example, suppose you're hired by the NRA, and you're asked, to get a survey that shows most Americans oppose gun control. Well, the thing to do is go to gun shows, shooting ranges, etc., gun stores, and ask people. I mean, you'll still get people who favor gun control, but most of them won't. So you can say, honestly, that 85% of those surveyed oppose it. Now, if your company is hired by Mothers Against Guns, and they want a survey that shows most people oppose guns, you would go places like, well, maybe like a rally against guns. Maybe go to an event involving shooting victims, because then you're going to find a lot of people who are opposed to it. And you can honestly report back that 95% of those you surveyed were supported gun control. So you can always kind of get the results you want by picking the sample you want to get. To use an analogy, it's kind of like gerrymandering in politics. gerrymandering in politics is when the people, the politicians divide up the, the zones. That way they can kind of guarantee the results of the election. And with a biased sample, you're kind of gerrymandering your sample. You're getting it so you get the results you want. And again, there are various reasons for that. Most typically for persuasive purposes. So they can put out advertising that people, most people believe this or that. Now the defense against it is to look at the sample. Who was sampled, how was it gathered? Also, as we'll see in the near future, were there ways the questions were asked, say in a survey, that would also bias it? So on the side of evil, the way to make this work for you is pick your sample in a way that gets you the results that you want. If you're trying to do correct generalizations, you'd want a representative sample if your goal is the truth. And the defense against it is to check, how was the sample taken, who or what was in it. Now this also applies to analogies, because the same thing can occur. It's where the sample used for it is biased in some way, so similar type of problem. So from a practical standpoint, say on test quizzes and assignments, how would you sort out between these three? Well, basically the way to remember it is this. Sample too small. So the example would be of a sample that's, well, small, too small. This one is the case where there's a story being told, and sort of the defining feature is there's an explicit rejection of, data, typically statistical data. It'd be something like someone saying, yeah, I know there are all these studies and science that say smoking is bad, but my Aunt Jane lived to be 102, smoking 85,000 cigars per day. And that'd be, a story rejecting a general claim and rejecting, this statistical evidence. With a biased generalization, the giveaway is in the name. There'd be something about the sample that would bias it. So if someone says, they went to their church to ask about God, or they went to the shooting range to ask about gun control, or they went to a rally for Bernie Sanders to ask about single-payer health care, those would all be biased generalizations. Now again, as a final reminder here, the bias is a relative thing. So if you want to know what Americans think about single-payer, and you just went and talked to people at a Bernie Sanders rally, that'd be biased. But if you want to know what Bernie Sanders followers think about single-payer, it wouldn't be biased, because it depends on who you want to know about. So if your target is all Americans, and you just talk to Bernie supporters, biased. If your target is Bernie supporters, and you just talk to Bernie supporters, that's fine, because that's who you want to know about. Before pressing on, anything about these three neat stuff. Okay. So kind of way to remember it is too small, story that rejects statistical data, and biased. And it's pretty much baked into their names, which is kind of handy. Okay, anything else before moving to our next slide? Now another fallacy that's kind of hard to avoid is what's called the self-selection fallacy. Now, before getting to the actual fallacy, we need to look at what a self-selected sample is. Now, a self-selected sample is this. It occurs when the participation in the sample has a barrier to entry. To use an analogy, it's got like a hurdle that person has to jump over, or a door they have to get through. There's an effort to it. Now you might say, but wait, don't all surveys and samples have some barrier? Don't you have to at the very least click some mouse, click some buttons or something? And the answer is yeah, and that'd be a good point, because at what point is it enough to be self-selected versus having to put in the effort? So it's not the person has to put in any effort to do it. The idea is that there is kind of a meaningful barrier between the people being surveyed and participation. And there can be debate about, what counts as too much of a barrier. Now, what would be examples of these? Well, Many of these are kind of obsolete today in the age of the interwebs, but here are some classic ones. One is, of course, the old style person on the street interview. And everyone's probably seen these that, they often end up, news stories, talk to people on the street. Now, that of course is self-selected because it's someone who's willing to take the time to stop and talk and happens to be there at that time. And of course, there's also selection on the part of the person doing the interview, because they're, judging who they're going to talk to. They're probably picking up people they think would say interesting things. And of course, it's a really small sample, so it's got all kinds of problems going on. But from the standpoint of self-selection, it's that the person is there at that time and willing to talk. Telephone surveys, especially now, they're, because the way the laws work, they just can't, call, back when mobile phones were, much more expensive and you had to pay for every call, they passed a law, not allowing people to like cold call people with no relation, because they basically, you were paying to have somebody call you to sell you some junk. Now the problem with telephone surveys is first, typically they're going to be calling landlines, and most people don't have landlines anymore. So you kind of select by being the person who has a landline. Also, if you happen to have a landline and someone calls and says, would you be willing to take 20 minutes of your time to answer some questions about, single-payer health care? Most people will say, no. Because it's, or if they even pick up the phone. And of course today with anyone who's got a phone has noticed this, I probably get 4 to 5 calls a day just from spoof numbers. People trying to sell me, I don't even answer. That's why she hurts, I can't even talk anymore. So I don't even answer my phone anymore because 90% of the calls I get, or 95%, are just spoof numbers trying to sell me crap or scam me or something. And so people generally wouldn't pick up. So if you're doing a telephone survey today, maybe someone who has a landline, who has the time, and is willing to pick up and talk to strangers. So it gives you a pretty narrow sample. Also questionnaires. Back before the interwebs, especially sad grad students. Well, actually, there's really no other comment. That's redundant. I remember when I was at Ohio State, there were always people in the social science and psychology, and they're always trying to get data. And back before the interwebs, you'd have to get people to do that, like filling out paper forms. And so there'd always be people on High Street handing out questionnaires, asking about psychology or sociology or something. And most people would take it. They'd stand there and someone hands them it and they'd take it, and they'd walk like 2 feet and put it in a trash can. I remember seeing one of my fellow grad students, and they would hand out all their questionnaires, and 9% of them would go in the trash, and they'd go and pull it out of the trash and go back to handing them out again, tears streaming down their faces. They're trying to graduate and go on and prove their parents wrong about that sociology degree. But of course, the people who fill it out would generally be people who are self-selected, there at that time, and willing to take the time to fill out that survey. So you tend to get people who are not representative. Another famous example of this, probably the most famous, goes back to the ancient days of 1993. Long ago. Actually, it's when I started teaching here, so super long ago. There's this fellow named Ross Perot who ran for president. Did he win? No, because we have no President Perot. Or do, who knows. And he took out basically an ad survey and TV guide. Now, back in '93, this is again before the interwebs, and so to do his survey, you'd have to take your TV guide and like tear out pages or photocopy it. And back then, I mean, today we've got, everyone's got a camera on their phone, there's scanners, but back then you have to go to like a bank or something or a school to photocopy it. Typically like 25 cents, 10 to 20 cents a page. And then you have to take it, fill it out, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, mail it. So fair amount of work. Now, his survey that came back gave the indication that he had a pretty good chance of winning. But here's the problem. The only people who are going to take the time to really, do all that stuff would be people with very strong opinions. Probably people who really either hate him or support him. Because the barrier is pretty high. You got to read the TV guide, you got to tear out the pages or copy them, you've got to fill out the thing, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, walking down to the post office, tons of work, no, I mean, not tons of work, but a pretty big barrier. And so the results were way off. So these are problematic. So it gives us this fallacy. The self-selection fallacy occurs when someone estimates a probability of a conclusion too high from a sample that is relatively large, but self-selected. And this is a special sort of bias generalization. In this case, the bias is a particular sort, namely, the people bias themselves. So the fault doesn't lie entirely with the person doing it. They're trying to get everybody. The problem kind of lies with, they make the barrier too high, so they're hoping to get everybody, but they only get the people who are willing to jump that barrier. So it would be unrepresentative. I mean, to use a metaphor, it'd be like putting up a big wall, and you're only asking people questions who can get over that wall. And a lot of people are like, I'm not going to go over that wall. And you only get people who are willing to risk the wall, and people who can climb the wall. So it's going to be a sample that is biased. So why do people use these if they're pretty useless? Well, they can be useless but interesting. So going back to the anecdotal evidence thing, statistics are kind of boring. That's why typically in conversations you don't hear normal people talking about, except for sports stats. But a person on a street interview, especially if the person is kind of interesting, entertaining, makes for an interesting story. So for example, like on the news, if you hear them talking about stats about the economy, most people are kind of turn out. But if they have a story about someone, for example, I heard a story this morning about someone who, they went to their doctor, they had like a MCL injury, and the doctor basically sold them a $200 brace for $800. And they could have just gone to like, Walmart or Target, gotten a similar brace for, $20. And of course, that's a more interesting story than going about the stats of overcharging. If you hear like, hospitals overcharge, this percentage, et cetera, of all kinds of graphs and charts, kind of boring. But if you hear a story of someone who's been ripped off, that's kind of an interesting story. But of course, it's also self-selected. It's people who, went and contacted the news agency with their story. But again, it can be interesting. So this can result in some, interesting anecdotes and stuff. But again, statistically, pretty useless. And as you might imagine today, you don't get a lot of this. I guess some people still kind of do this, but generally doesn't work. And this is done mostly not for statistical significance, but just because it's interesting that people say stuff. Occasionally you hit the gold mine with someone saying some really interesting or super radical stuff. It's always fun to see the interviewer trying to pull the microphone away from them as they talk about some conspiracy. Good times. Now we turn to building surveys. Now, depending on what field you go into, you may have to do surveys. And it may actually surprise you where you're thinking, I'll never have to do surveys, I'm doing something that's not stupid like survey stuff. But you'll be surprised you'll end up doing surveys, because they're like, everything now, of course, is data-driven. And it means they just make up stuff. And one way they get the data to drive around is by doing surveys. I didn't think I would be doing much with surveys, except for like, asking students like how terrible the class was, etc. But now, because I'm an assessment, I do surveys all the time. And so I've had to learn how to write ones that are not terrible. And if you go into something like business or marketing, any field, you're probably going to have to deal with surveys, either creating questions or assessing them. It's kind of how things are done for now. So when you're building questions, there's kind of two mission objectives, two possible ones. One is truth, where you want to get the facts. Now, in my case, since I'm doing stuff with like assessment, my goal is to get the truth. There are other cases, though, where the goal is not the truth. The goal is to get numbers to weaponize for political, economic purposes, for persuasive purposes. So you can, say that, if you're a politician, to say that a large percentage of Americans back you, etc. Now, we'll look at this both from the side of good, getting to the truth, and the side of evil, getting the numbers you want to get. First thing is this, and these kind of tie together. One is the way you ask the question can determine or strongly sway your results. For example, if I ask people, would you like a huge government-sponsored, government-controlled system that pays for medical expenses but is rife with corruption and is abused constantly? Would you want that? Yes or no? No, who wants that? But if I say, do you want Medicare that will provide you with medical coverage in your old age when you're not working anymore, you're going to say, yes, I want some of that. Same thing, Medicare, but the way you put it, huge government controlled versus, you know, insurance coverage for when you're no longer working, you have no private insurance anymore. So you can take almost anything and make it sound good or terrible. So if I said something like, do you want a frozen entity that is packed full of chemicals and sugar? Do you want some ice cream? Of course you want ice cream. Ice cream is delicious. And so depending on how you describe it, you can make even good things sound terrible and terrible things sound good. So kind of a key thing is when you're building surveys, on the side of truth, you want to phrase your questions neutrally, because you want to get what people, you know, really think. Now on the side of evil, you'd want to word them differently. So for example, suppose you're a researcher, a sad graduate student, again that's redundant, and you're doing, you're in, say, sociology or social science, and you want to know what people think about single-payer healthcare. And you're working on your dissertation, and you don't have like an agenda for this. You just want to know what do people think. In that case, you'd want to word your questions as neutrally as possible, so that way you don't get people, you know, leaning for or against. And it can actually be pretty hard to describe, you know, controversial issues neutrally, because if you go kind of the wrong way in the wording, you'll kind of trigger people. And if you word it kind of like with lefty language, people on the right will be all against it. If you word it kind of righty language, people on the left will all be against it. It can be really hard to get what people really think about complicated, controversial political issues, because it's really hard to get a neutral word. Now on the side of evil, suppose you're hired to give a politician, you know, numbers that show that Americans hate single payer. Well, in that case, you want to word it in a way that triggers people. You know, huge government, you know, bureaucracy interfering with your choice. You want a huge bureaucracy interfering with your choice of what doctor you can use. Pretty much everyone's going to say no. I don't want any of that. And you can get results, depending on how you ask it, in very different ways. Give a real concrete illustration. Remember Obamacare back in the day? People found that if you worded it like neutrally, most people were for the stuff. You know, things like pre-existing conditions, etc. But if you worded it, you know, in conservative, you know, terms, people were against it, even though it was the same exact thing. And so you can pretty much always get the numbers you want just by asking it the right way. So on the side of good, you got to work hard to make neutral questions. And that can be really hard if you're dealing with controversial stuff. On the side of evil, you just got to word in a way that gets the results you want. Now, if other people are going to like look at the survey, you don't want to be like too over the top, but you can make it, you know, pretty low, pretty biased, pretty easily. Second, sequence of questions. The order in which you ask questions also affects the results. Now, if you're trying to get the truth, you'd want to be careful to avoid the sequencing effect. You don't want the answer to one question to bias people in the next one, because you want people to give, you know, truthful answers, or, well, unbiased answers. Now, on the side of evil, you can influence the results even more by asking a question that sets up another question. For example, suppose you're hired by a teachers union and they want a survey that shows most people support raises for teachers. One way to do this would be wording. You could ask, given that the teachers have not received a raise in a decade, would it be fair for them to request, you know, a modest raise? And most people would say, sure. Also, you can do a sequence. You can have a question first that says, are you aware or unaware that teachers have not received a raise in 10 years? Now, the point of that question is not to get it to see if you know, it's for the next question, which is, do you favor, teachers getting a raise? And if you see the first question, that tells you they haven't got a raise in 10 years. So the second one, you'll say, yeah, they probably should get a raise. And so on the side of evil, what you'll often want to do is have questions that are there not to get information, but to sway people. So they read that question, it affects the result of the next question. Combining these two together, you can get pretty much any result you want, which is why whenever you hear politicians and think tanks talking about the issues, they can pretty much always say, most people agree with us. Not because most people agree with them, but because of the way they worded it. Another important thing is, on the side of the truth, is having the no opinion option. Because sometimes people have no opinion. And if you force people to pick between things, and there's only, those options, you may not get their real view. For example, we're going to have election coming up in 2020, just a few short months away. And what they'll typically do is ask, do you support the Democrat or the Republican? And of course, that's going to skew the results if you just ask that, because there may be people who want none of the above. And so if you only give, and sometimes questions will say, okay, if you have to pick between the Democrat and Republican, who would you pick? But they should always give an option of no opinion, because that's an important result. Because it may be that people don't want any of that. And if you only give people, those choices, and they have to answer it, they'll pick the thing they dislike the least. And it can still be biased. So if you want to find the truth, you always want to give an option, where appropriate, no opinion, or none of the above. Now we can also put in, going back to ways of asking, kind of questions that are loaded, that rest on one or more unwarranted assumptions. So it may say something like, would you support the politically biased, conspiracy theorist-oriented, crazy Democrats in their witch hunt against Donald Trump? And worded like that, most people would say, well, I can't get behind crazy witch hunting stuff. Or maybe some Democrats would be like, yeah, I'm on board. And so questions be loaded in a way that lead people towards a particular answer. So on the side of good, you have to really struggle with neutral wording, avoid sequencing, avoid loaded questions, always include a no opinion option. And it can be really hard to design a good survey, especially for controversial things like immigration, gun control, abortion, etc. On the side of evil, it can be also pretty challenging, because if you want to get the result you want without being too obvious, you have to forge the questions that lead people the way you want them to go. And that's actually it's actually easier to make a biased survey than a neutral one. A final technique is push polling. And now, it's often linked now to robocalling, which is totally legal in most cases. John Oliver did a pretty good show on robocalling. Now, push polling is this. The idea of a push poll is not to get your opinion, but to put out something, typically something negative, but it could be something positive, in the form of a question. And one thing that's handy about questions is, questions aren't statements. So a question can never be a lie, which is a pretty useful technique. So if you ever want to lie without lying, lie with a question, because technically it's never a lie, because you're not making any claim. I learned this in high school. I was in a debate, and my debate partner and I, we were doing the global politics of arms sales. And the issue that year was the United States should significantly curtail arms sales abroad. And we did some weird research and found out we were selling weapons to the Soviet Union. And people just, we certainly brought that up, people would freak out, they're like, we don't sell weapons to the Soviet Union? And we're like, yeah, we do. We shouldn't do that. And then when we got lazy, one opposing team did their homework, and they were ready to put the hammer to us. And they did. They hammered us pretty hard. But then during cross-ex, I got up and said, are you aware that your source was found out to be a Russian operative who said all these things as lies in order to, continue America selling these weapons to the Soviet Union? And they gave up. And the judge, at the end, he said, can I see your evidence for that? And I said, there's no evidence because questions. He said, well, aren't you lying? I said, questions cannot be lies. He said, you should go into politics. I say, sir, you wound me, sir. But it's true. A question is never a lie. So push polling often works by asking a question that's designed to get a negative result. So for example, it could be something, kind of moderate in its negativity, like something like, would you support, Senator so-and-so knowing that they back sanctuary cities? And the idea, of course, is trying to push that they bank sanctuary cities. And there are some infamous ones that are like super sexist or super racist. They present some sort of attack on someone as a question. And again, it is a question, so technically not a lie, it's just asking a question. Now, there's some debate about how effective this actually is, because usually, again, it's robocalls, which most people already hate, but there's some evidence that it can work. So if someone, gets a thing in their voicemail about how terrible someone supposedly is in the form of a question, they may be influenced. And again, it's often linked to like racist and sexist stuff. Not surprising. Okay, so that's how to build surveys for good or evil. Now, if you do this professionally, then you would probably end up taking an entire course in survey building, depending on your field, sociology, anthropology, political science, business, to get them to work right. And it's surprisingly hard to make ones that are good. Easy to make terrible ones, hard to make good ones. And since today everything is data-driven, you'll probably be working with surveys, creating them, or at the very least looking at results. Now, moving away from creating them in terms of assessing them, whenever you get a survey and the results matter to you, you'd want to consider these questions. How was it built? And if it really matters, you'd want to actually see the questions they use, see the actual survey, to see if the results really do have integrity. Because if the questions are, biased and sequencing and so on, then the survey is less reliable. And again, if it does matter. Before pressing on, anything about slanted questions that needs more sequence or stuff? Weak analogy, sometimes called false analogy. Now, this occurs when someone, again, it's about overestimating probability, someone puts too much confidence in the conclusion of an analogy based on the analogy not actually being strong enough. Put another way, going back to our standards for arguing by analogy, the idea, of course, is that the two things being compared have to be enough alike, have to be similar in relevant ways, have to not be dissimilar in relevant ways, or smushing it all together. The more alike they are in the more diverse ways, the better. The more not alike they are in more diverse ways, the worse. So a weak or false analogy, or poor analogy, is one in which the things being compared are not enough alike to make the analogy work, that the analogs are too different. Now, in some cases, this can be a substantial debate and battle about whether two things really are alike enough to say, to draw the conclusion. For example, in intro class that I teach, there's one of the papers that people do, you've had the class, you've done this paper, is Socrates makes his famous horse trainer analogy. And Socrates was accused by the people who opposed him, Miletus, etc., of corrupting the youth. And he gets Miletus to say that everyone in Athens benefits the youth except for Socrates is the only corrupter. And Socrates breaks out his horse trainer analogy, and he says, well, the reality is this. In the case of the horses, it is the few, the trainer, who has knowledge that benefits the horses. The many who don't know what they're doing, if they were given charge of the horses, they'd be like, what do they eat? I don't know, maybe ice cream, roast beef or something? They would probably harm them. And then Socrates reasons by analogy, in the case of the youth, the same should hold true. The many would corrupt and harm them, the few would benefit them. So Socrates, he concludes, can't be the only corrupter. So the battle there is whether he's got a good analogy or a bad one. Now, in some cases, like this one, this can be hotly contested. Is the comparison is it a good analogy? Is it a good comparison? And if you think that it is, you would try to show how, in this case, the youth are like horses, the training of horses is like the training of the youth, so the analogy is good. If you think it's a bad analogy, you try to do the opposite. You try to show that they aren't enough alike and it's a bad or weak analogy. Another example, which also can be debated, a while back, there was a change made to the inheritance tax, sometimes called the death tax. You're not taxed for dying, there's no dying's still free. And then you can get taxed for like being buried and stuff. Now it used to be that, roughly speaking, if you died and left your money to somebody, there would be no tax on it, I think up to like millions of dollars. And for 99.9% of people, that's like, not a problem because we don't pay that much money. But recently, in the past couple of years, it was changed so it was increased, dramatically. So I think like a couple can leave like $11 million, and the first $11 million is tax-free. And this leads to a debate about if you believe like in a competitive economy and fairness, is that fair? Can you say I believe in a fair system where everybody competes equally? The United States is perfectly fair, so there's nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. And an argument that I made was one involving the game of Monopoly. So everyone's played Monopoly, or at least heard of it, or been forced to play it. Now in the normal game of Monopoly, everyone starts off equal, same amount of money, etc. You play the game. But imagine this: imagine you played Monopoly, and at the end of the game, you take all the stuff a person won, and all their money and all their property, and you put it like in a pile. In the next game, one random player gets selected, and they start with that stuff. So the start of the new game, they have all that money, all that property. Now, would you play that game? No, because if you're not the lucky person to get all of that stuff, you are going to lose. So you could argue by analogy, if you believe that in a fair competitive system, you'd have to argue that inheritance is inherently unfair, that it does not allow for free competition. Now, and of course, this is an argument by analogy. Namely, in Monopoly, this would be unfair. None of us would play this game. We would say this is completely unfair and unacceptable. So if we accept the principle of fairness for our society, we'd have to say that inheritance, or large-scale inheritance, we're not talking about like Aunt Bessie's, shotgun collection or something, would be unfair. Now, of course, a person could argue against that and say that that's a bad analogy. How so? Well, one big difference is, of course, in Monopoly there's only one winner, and in life there are more than one winner. Also, people point out that in the case of Monopoly, it's a very limited board. In the case of life, it's like a bigger board. And so you could argue this is a bad analogy. But you could argue part of the battle also comes down to kind of like what's the point of the analogy. Because someone could say, yeah, it pretty quickly breaks down. Life is not, it may be like a box of chocolates, but it's not exactly like a game of Monopoly. But you could try to defend against this charge of weak analogy by saying, yeah, my point is not that life is exactly like Monopoly, but that if we think that this would be unfair, then we'd have to accept that if we believe in fairness and free competition, we can't also believe in inheritance. We can't accept that. And then, of course, someone could counter that as well and try to show the analogy is weak. So you end up with this kind of this battle where one side is trying to say, this is a good analogy. The other side is saying, no, that's a weak, that's a bad analogy. And as you might imagine, if you're doing something controversial like inheritance involving money, people can get pretty, pretty angry. Now, what would be like a non-political, non-controversial example? Well, let's take one from the science. Now, pretty much most animal studies today, like when they test medicine or do animal studies, what animal do they use?
Rat.
Yeah, rats. You know, rats, mice, etc. And their reasoning is by analogy, that whatever is like bad for these mice or rats is bad for us, whatever's good for them is good for us. Turns out, though, those are probably all weak analogies. Why? Well, even though rats are more like us than, say, monsters, they're still quite a bit different from us. And so one sort of unfortunate thing, especially for the rats that get tested on, mice that get tested on, is that most of the results actually don't extend from them to us. And so they're actually, the reason, why do they use them? Well, one reason is they're super cheap, and they're really easy to handle. You know, you don't really hear about like mice breaking out and taking over the world, except for, of course, Pinky and Brain, classic threat. But pretty much all of that sciencey stuff is probably a weak analogy. They're really not that much like us, which is why many studies end up failing, because it's like, this was great for the rats, but not so great for us, or this killed the rats, but it may not kill us. Probably will. Okay, so if you're making analogies on the side of good, you would want to, again, make a good analogy. And if you're fighting someone over analogy, you're trying to show that their analogy is weak, that it breaks down. Now again, this can be quite a battle, especially in cases where there's a lot of emotional attachment. To give one that's really emotional, think about white nationalists arguing that they are Nazis, because they're analogous to Nazis. You take the Nazi list, you take the white nationalist list and check it off, and it all checks. And you say, by analogy, white nationalists are just Nazis with better branding. And that's a good way to get all kinds of death threats on the interwebs, if you put up a video about that. And so that would be a case where you'd have this battle. The people who think that white nationalists are Nazis would try to argue the analogy doesn't hold. They're not, they don't want to genocide people, they just don't want any people who are different color here. But it's all going to be peaceful. So we can have really controversial battles over, are things actually analogous? Before pressing on to vague generalities, anything about analogies that need stuff? Vague generalities. We saw in the past vagueness. And going back to my metaphor, vagueness is like driving in the fog. Everything is too fuzzy, too foggy. So it's not clear, it's not precise. So vague generalities are statements that are too vague to be meaningful. Now, they're often used, as you might imagine, in advertising and in politics, because you make something sound good without promising really anything. For example, suppose I'm running for office in 2020, which I can't because I've got a job and I have to make money, otherwise I starve. Which one of the problems of, I guess I'd say, with the political system is you got to be able to take like a couple of years off without working to run for office. But anyways, so suppose I was running, which I'm not in 2020, and I say, I will reform education in a way that allows all Americans, regardless of their economic class, to attend the school of their choice and to not be burdened with a crushing debt of student loans. What have I promised you? Maybe. I'm glad you thought that. Vote for me. But what have I really promised you?
Nothing.
Yeah, probably nothing. I mean, I've said some nice words, some generalities that I'll do some stuff, but it could mean maybe free tuition, maybe not. I really haven't promised anything particular, but it does sound good. Most slogans are like that. For example, in advertising, you have "Make America Great Again." What exactly does that mean? Well, it means that someone plagiarized from Ronald Reagan, but who knows what that means? Or if you have something like Cocat's Life or Just Do It, they all sound good, but of course they don't really mean anything. So if you want to say something good or bad without committing, vague generalities are great. You just say something that is very general, not very precise. Trump is really good at this, because maybe accidentally, because he'll say like they say or people say about how great I am, or people say there's terrible danger on the southern border, and it's a general statement that's too vague to really be meaningful. Yeah, there's at least some people who say there's a great danger on the southern border, so that's, I guess, kind of true, but what does it really mean? Now, the side of evil, this is great for advertising and politics. If you plan to go into a career, advertising, marketing, politics, it's a critical skill to master, the vague generality. You want to describe what you're doing in vague, positive generalities: make America great again, hope and change, just do it, Cocat's Life. But you don't want to commit too much, because you don't really want to have anything people can really call you on. And how would you disprove hope and change? All you do is have some hope and have a little change, a pocket change. And of course you can also use it negatively. You present like ominous but vague threats about them and they. And it can be quite effective. But if someone calls you on it, you can, say, no, I didn't mean them or they. Dog whistling, for example, among racists, commonly uses this. A vague statement that people who aren't in on the whistle don't get what it means. People who are in the whistle know what it means. But the person can say, no, I didn't really mean that. So it's a way to say awful things without committing. So how do you defend against it? Well, one way to do it is, one main defense again is, well, if it's too vague to know what it means, is to essentially treat it that way, to say, I don't know what this means. So like the thing I said about, I pretend running for president, I made that glowing generality about education. The thing to think is, what am I actually being offered here? Is it free tuition? Did he say free tuition? He did not say free tuition. And so in that case, you would say, well, he's really promised me nothing, nothing at all. So 0 goes into that box. Now in other cases, what you can try to do is try to do what we saw before, a sample frame. What is meant by, say, suppose I promise affordable college education. Well, what does that mean? What is it for? How do we define affordable? Now, of course, if you don't have any information from the person making these claims, you have to kind of guess. What do they probably mean by affordable? Now, as I mentioned, this can both go positive, a glowing generality. An example I gave about, with education, that all sounds good. And of course, you can have the negative stuff as well, that designed to scare and frighten people. So on the side of evil, very useful tool. If you want to make people feel good, say something very vague and general about, this is a great new generation that is going to go on to lead America into a bright new future, which of course means really nothing. Or if you want to scare people, say something vague and ominous. Like, there are people coming here to commit the crimes. They're not the best of people. And that is really vague. What does that mean? But it sounds kind of scary and ominous. And again, the defense is to say basically, what does it actually mean? What am I being promised? What am I actually being threatened with? Okay, before going to our next exciting slide, anything about any of this stuff, the needs stuff? So that is to the end of our Chapter 10 adventures. So, recapping in our last few minutes, things to note. First, of course, the general stuff about inductive arguments. As we saw, they deal in probability. So the hallmark of induction is premises, because they're arguments, they give you premises supporting a conclusion, but what makes them what they are is, they just give you a probability. They say, hi there, I'm an inductive argument. You give me true premises, and if I'm a strong one, I'll probably give you a true conclusion. No promises though. If I'm a weak one, if you give me true premises, I probably won't hand you back a true conclusion. But I might though, who knows? We may be lucky. So it's a matter of, relative strength or relative weakness. So when you're looking at inductive arguments, they kind of stack up against each other. Which one is stronger, which one is weaker. Now, we also saw the concept of the probability of the conclusion. So when you're testing arguments for strength, it's basically how they compare to each other. Probability of the conclusion is, setting aside the arguments, what is the likelihood, given all the available evidence, what is the likelihood that conclusion is true? And they're separate matters, as we saw. So one question is, again, going back to a legal analogy, suppose you think Trump is super guilty of collusion, and the Mueller report came out, or Mueller report says what? No collusion. Now, if you think Mueller engaged in good reasoning, and you look at it, it's all good logic, you'd have to say, well, that's a strong argument. You may think the conclusion is totally wrong, but you would have to say, well, that's good logic. Like in a court case. You could be in a jury, and you may think this person is totally guilty, but if you're doing your job as a juror, you wouldn't go by, I think this person is totally guilty. You'd go by, is the evidence given to me and the arguments made by the prosecution, does that show beyond reasonable doubt that they are guilty, regardless of what I think? You may think, oh yeah, this person is super guilty. Like in the O.J. Simpson trial. Most people thought O.J. probably did it. But the question is not, is it true he did it? In the court of law, the question is, can the prosecution prove it? Which is a separate matter. Because you may say, yeah, totally guilty, but the process has to be there. And arguments, that's how the arguments work. So the question is the logic good? And you can have terrible logic supporting a true conclusion, or great logic supporting a false conclusion. Okay, so next time, more stuff. So a good rest of the day, and I'll see you on the first day.